how we make sense of our reality is really at the cornerstone of how we make almost all of our decisions in our lives as individuals, but also as a society. And it's been talked about a lot that during, the last several years, and even prior to that, that the overall process of sense making has been breaking down in a massive way. And one of the key things to that is, of course, journalism and media, and how we have what we call professionals breaking down events and then conveying it in a meaningful way to people who then are making sense and saying, okay, here's how I'm going to make decisions. But what happens when we're looking at what's happened over the last several years and we have this feeling something seriously is wrong within media, something seriously is wrong within journalism, and it's hard to put our finger on exactly what it is. So we've been attempting to do that. And to help go a little bit further here, I have Richard Garner. He's a media expert and a host of the Third Way podcast. And we're going to talk about some of his experiences, and I'm sure I'll throw in some of mine, with regards to what we've seen and also what we've heard directly from mainstream media about what's been going on during the last 2 years. Welcome, Richard. Why don't we start with some anecdotes of what you've heard directly from people inside mainstream media about what happened over the last couple of years?
Sure. Yeah. And, as you sort of touched on, I've been in that world for, we're going on 27 years now. So as you would imagine, you have friends, colleagues, and, across the board in various newsrooms. So initially, and again, people of all stripes and all beliefs. But what I got, I remember in a conversation specifically with somebody from the CBC here in Canada, and it was a reporter, and I was talking to this person early on during COVID when there was a lot of question marks. There were decisions being made with certainty where there clearly wasn't certainty. There was still a lot of ambiguity. Data was coming in. Why were we making these absolutist decisions at this point without, breaking down the data more? Why were there not more stakeholders in the decision-making process that included people who understood economics, mental health, and all these other? Why was the approach so quickly becoming a hammer and everything was a nail? And then I just finished the conversation with, so would you do this story? Like, would you pitch this story right now in your newsroom? And she just laughed and said, no effing way. Now we both, and again, because she, and it was interesting because her answer wasn't a surprise to me. We both laughed because inherently we both did know already that the ship had sailed on dissension on this particular issue. Now, this gets into the bigger and broader sort of context of what, you've talked about before is, what happens? Like, what happens? How does censorship happen? Well, you and I have talked about it before too. And these things, when you get into obviously human beings, whether individually or collectively, especially when there's fear, where there's bias, there's emotion, you quickly abandon rationality and logic. That's gone very early on. People think it matters. It doesn't matter, obviously. Truth doesn't matter. Objectivity certainly doesn't matter. What matters very quickly in mob rule, when people are worried about their own survival, people are afraid, people are nervous, people are concerned. Well, what takes over, not just with the general public, but obviously within media, because again, it's kind of like when people talk about scientists as though they're robots, right? And I'll say to somebody, you realize they're just human beings, right? They have biases, they have emotions. You're talking about scientists like they're somehow incapable of ever not having, you know what I mean? Like, it's insane to me. They're affected by politics, they're affected by ego, they're affected by everything that every human being is, just as journalists are. And what is the ultimate default, Joe, when in really you could call it the operating system of the human being, but especially when a threat is introduced into the ecosystem? Well, the ultimate default for every human being in the world is survival. The end. So just like you, me, or anybody else, they feel threatened, they go into a very binary, a very what's in my best interest mode, not necessarily consciously, but certainly subconsciously. So all of a sudden, just as this reporter was telling me that, yeah, I agree with you, these things are crazy, whatever, but wouldn't even consider pitching the story about that in their newsroom. Well, why is that? Because the ship has already sailed again on the ability to have a debate about this issue.
Did you hear of any of that? Did you hear anything in Canada about how or why people might not, at a high level, have been told to run their newsrooms in an objective way?
Well, I mean, there's a recent story that I encourage everybody to search. A woman by the name of Rachel Emmanuel left iPolitics recently to go to the Western Standard online, and she cited the reasons uh, for that, which include a lot of some of the things we're talking about. Very specifically, though, what the straw that broke the camel's back for her was a story she had done about Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and the Minister of, I can't remember which Minister of whatever. And there was a story that had circulated. You might be familiar with it. Obviously you are, Joe, about she was holding a scarf that had the colors of a specific group in the Ukraine. And she has heritage that just sort of overlaps with that part of the world, et cetera, et cetera. And these colors of this particular group turned out to be of a neo-Nazi group. And ironically, right after the Freedom Convoy, where people were talking about, we can't tolerate these Nazi flags, whatever, there was X amount of reporters that were like, wow, this is crazy. Like, we got to report on that. And Rachel Emmanuel reported on it on iPolitics, and then she saw the story afterwards changed. And it was because, in talking to her editor, and again, you can find this out for yourself, the editor said that they got calls from Chrystia Freeland's office saying, this is the real whatever. Now, again, back to your original question, is somebody calling up from the Prime Minister's office or from the Minister of External Affairs office and saying, look, don't do that story, or we're going to kill you and your family? Well, this is what people want to, some sort of deep throat. No, it's not. It's the game of politics and media revolves around one thing. People very rarely talk about it, probably because it's undeniable: access. So if you want to report on anything to do with government, you require access to people. Well, how do you get access to ministers and whatever? Because you ultimately report what they tell you. And if you start to question and start to push back, and you just get cut off. All of a sudden, your competition is getting the scoop, getting the interview, and you're not getting it. So the whole idea of beat journalism, where you're following whether it's external affairs or defense or whatever, is ridiculous. The Pentagon doesn't matter, because your entire existence, your career relies on you getting access to these people. So if they shut you off, you're finished. So you have to parrot what they say.
You have Rebel News, who lost access in a sense when they were at that Trudeau. They were at I believe it was a press conference or that Trudeau was holding, and journalist stands up, yeah, I'm so and so from Rebel News, and he's just like, I'm not going to answer your question because you're from Rebel News, basically, right? And it was almost like, because Rebel News doesn't toe the line on what is acceptable in the mainstream culture, they're not allowed to ask the Prime Minister a question. And interestingly enough, it's like even during the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, there was a lot more access in some of the police press conferences that went on. There was a lot more independent journalists there than you would typically see. And some of the questions that were asked to the police chief were just remarkably different than the tone you would hear from mainstream media. And you would see almost the reactions on the police chief face, like, wow, I'm not used to this kind of thing, right? So it's like, again, we're seeing that problem of just like hypering down certain voices only what's acceptable in the mainstream coverage. This is what then informs, the public. And I think what it seems like is all these journalists that are defecting from mainstream are seeing the utter damage that is causing to a mass society. They're seeing that this tiny little echo chamber that is mainstream media and what it covers is creating this huge problem. And so they're like, I don't want to be part of this anymore. And interestingly enough, and I'd love to get your take on this, is I asked several mainstream journalists while we were down in Ottawa, one of them from CTV, a lot of people know him, Evan Solomon. I asked him outright, like, do you really stand by all of the coverage that you and CTV has done about the Freedom Convoy? And he says, yes, I honestly do. I honestly believe that what we've done has been very fair and has been excellent reporting. And it's fascinating because you literally have, mass journalists who are saying, wow, the mainstream media, the way they covered this freedom convoy was so unfair, right? You have the public, they're saying it's so unfair that I don't know if I could ever trust mainstream media again. And I'm not talking about conspiracy theorist type people. I'm talking regular people saying, I may never be able to trust mainstream media again just in their coverage of mainstream or of the freedom convoy. Is there an echo chamber happening there?
Well, when you get your cues from the prime minister of the country saying what he was saying, it's not easy then to sort of delineate if you're a journalist, what's okay. Well, the gloves are off. I can say anything, do anything, because these people have already been identified by the leader of this country as not worthy of fair coverage, of not worthy of objectivity. So that was, that's the sort of, the starting point for that type of, like to your point, unfair coverage. But again, people are people, right? So you don't have a lot of people that consciously believe that, or will be able to admit to themselves that they're not being fair. I mean, it's very rare somebody's going to actually say, look, I know we aren't being fair, but it happens. And again, I've had conversations with people that will outright call out their own lack of ethics in terms of the coverage, especially during the Freedom Convoy and especially during COVID. It's, over the last couple of years, to acknowledge that in the end, of course, they were stories they were spiking, meaning not doing, and stories they were elevating and amplifying.
Was there anybody else that you spoke to, within mainstream media that had interesting things to say?
Yeah, I mean, I had, one of the more senior editorial people in the country used the words dangerous in terms of describing the current climate in the newsroom, and cited 1984, George Orwell's 1984. Now, for somebody of that level to use something that would be considered hyperbole generally if you were saying it was shocking to me, but it was not untrue. This person, and again, these things are echoed, in what Tara Henley wrote when she left CBC, and I'll read some of this actually because it essentially echoes what this person was saying. It has become necessary to be less adversarial to government and corporations and more hostile to ordinary people because of Twitter. To work in mainstream media now is to consent to the idea that a growing list of subjects are simply off the table, that dialogue itself can be harmful, that the big issues of our time are already settled. Now think about that, Joe. Like, that's the thing. There's a fluidity to life and issues, and that's why debate always exists, especially in academic circles, but obviously also in op-eds and journalism, asking questions. And where we've arrived, certainly throughout the COVID experience, but now, dovetailing into, the situation in the Ukraine, et cetera, is that it's no longer journalists asking questions about things. How did this happen? Why did this happen? What's the historical context to this? Is there a different way to see this? What about this? Can we ask this question? Those were all fundamental parts of journalism 101.
Yeah, it feels like it's like, we saw so much messaging from the government about, the science is settled and we're following the science. Like, Trudeau to this day is still saying that the federal vaccine mandate for the unvaccinated people to not travel is in place because, unlike all the provinces who are dropping all their vaccine mandates, he claims that his government is actually following the science, right? And so when you have that message coming out over and over again, you assume that they actually have science to support that decision, which they don't, because the science actually goes against vaccine mandates in most cases. But even that is still a bit of an argument that people are having. But generally, it's like this goes back to like, what's the solution, right? It's like you have the recipients of this information, right? So the general public who is taking in news and journalism, and then you have the creators of it at the mainstream level, right? And in the world right now, it's like the mainstream kind of has the authority in a sense, although that's definitely falling apart significantly. And it's hard to expect that the mainstream journalists are all just going to kind of start shifting the way that they're looking at things, but the recipient, the people, us watching this video, us creating these videos, we can navigate this information, we can find ways to take a breath, take a step back, and say, what is actually going on? To you, what is the solution here?
Well, I mean, we are in I think a strange time historically, right? I mean, for a lot of reasons. Social media is really, a little more than 15 years old. Certainly, this phenomenon that the purveyors of information are, three or four big tech companies in the world that are private companies that act like utilities, but ultimately can decide what is misinformation and what isn't, according to whatever, their standards might be or whatever they decide. These are scary times. But the glass half full is the truth is, when I was younger, if you wanted to get this type of independent information out, like what the Pulse does and other, other outlets, you were really limited to, going down, standing on a soapbox and handing out pamphlets. There is a lot of excellent alternative perspective information getting out there. But of course, what are we seeing? When it rises to the level of threat, meaning threatening the status quo, threatening the establishment, that's when all of a sudden people start talking about censoring, misinformation. We got to do more to limit these dangerous opinions. These are things that really sort of align with a kind of a state media type. And again, I'll use Tara Henley's very eloquent way she talked about her fears, with what was going on at CBC specifically. She said, right now, to work in mainstream media is to capitulate to certainty, to shut down your own critical thinking, to stamp out curiosity, to keep your mouth shut, to not ask questions, and to not rock the boat. And then she asked, this why the world burns. And then she asks, I think somewhat rhetorically, how could good journalism be done under such conditions? How could any of this possibly be healthy for society? If you want to really check out the history of this particular approach, there's a great book called The Dark Days in the Newsroom. It was, I think, Edward Allwood, and it's from 2007, but it speaks specifically about different times historically where this has happened, because this isn't the first. But the one area that I think needs to be explored and revisited historically that I think is most apt in terms of a comparison to what's going on now is McCarthyism. If you're not familiar with McCarthyism in the United States, with Senator Joseph McCarthy, when everyone in the 50s was super worried about communism, et cetera, they started to target anybody who just had left-leaning opinions and labeled them as communists and ruined them, blackballed them, whether it be from Hollywood, from politics. And specifically, they figured out quite quickly that they needed to go after the media. And when they did, of course, reporters, journalists that had, covered unions or wage class issue wars, that all of a sudden got them branded as left-leaning commies or reds, and their careers were over. You didn't need to tell the rest of the reporters and journalists not to do those stories, because they already saw what happened to the people that did. We are living currently in a modern day McCarthyism. And unfortunately, there's enough people out there that really default to their own personal survival when they start to see other people get hurt. But it's going to take courage. It's going to take integrity. And it's going to take people like you, Joe, at the Pulse to continue, because I do see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, it seems as though almost like these events of moving through this chaos, if you will, or this darker time, and having it come to light, and humanity collectively saying, yes, this is the state of our media, which is ultimately reflective of the state of ourselves, the state of ourselves as people. Okay, now that we see that, it's time to address it. It's time to do something about it. And I think that there's a number of different conversations that are happening. I know we do it a lot on this channel as to why that's sort of playing into it and what's going on within our state of mind, our state of being, our worldview, all these sorts of things that feeds into why this is happening. But yeah, I mean, I think this is it's an inspiring time, even though it's a somewhat of a chaotic time in a sense.
Well, again, like, how do you grow, right? Individually, collectively, you gotta You got to get comfortable with discomfort. And this is an uncomfortable time in a lot of ways.
Well, as always, I think the breakdown here and sharing your anecdotes and everything and your expertise and wisdom on this is helpful, gives people a lot to think about. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, great stuff, Joe. Keep up the good work.